Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Al Monitor, and this week we'll be talking with Al Monitor columnist Bijan Khajehpour, managing partner of Eurasian Nexus Partners, a Vienna-based international strategic consulting firm. Bijan will be talking with us about the prospects for U.S.-Iran relations under a Biden administration, the candidates and issues shaping Iran's presidential elections next year, Iran's relationships with Russia, China, and Middle Eastern countries, why regime change hasn't worked in Iran, and whether there might be a chance for the release of Americans unjustly imprisoned in Iran. My conversation with Bijan Khajehpour begins after this short break.
The experience of the JCPOA taught the Iranians that you can't really have the European Union without the US. And as long as the US is out there sanctioning Iran with primary and secondary sanctions, they have to forget the Western powers and focus on the Eastern powers. And this is exactly what's happening. A focus on the Eastern powers for two reasons. One is they can act independently. They are not going to always watch what the Americans are saying. And second, their trade and investment relations with Russia and China are not attached to political and human rights issues and debates on other levels. And these are exactly the two types of expectations that Iran would have.
That was Al Monitor columnist Bijan Khajehpour, who will be joining us shortly. It probably goes without saying or saying again that Iran will be the most challenging issue in the Middle East for the incoming Biden administration. Now, despite Biden's commitment to re-enter the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or Iran nuclear deal if Iran is in compliance, doing so may not be so easy, especially if Biden is serious about wanting to engage Iran in discussions about modifying the agreement, which Iran has opposed. And it won't be easy if Iran is serious about demanding compensation and an apology for the Trump administration's maximum pressure policies and sanctions since May 2018, when the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. Biden is unlikely to give an apology or offer compensation. Our guest today, Bijan Khajehpour, managing partner of Eurasian Nexus Partners in Vienna, suggests that despite the current official statements, there are indeed possibilities for creative diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran. For those of you who know Bijan and read his articles at Al Monitor and elsewhere, you know that he is one of the most highly regarded and in-demand experts on Iran anywhere, as you will hear from our conversation, which begins now. Bijan, welcome to On the Middle East.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let's get into it. Iran President Hassan Rouhani has said he expects the U.S. to re-enter the nuclear deal without conditions. Earlier, he said that Iran expects compensation for losses suffered as a result of U.S. sanctions and an apology. Joe Biden has said he will return to the Iran nuclear deal if Iran is in compliance, and would like to try to strengthen some provisions and extend the deadlines which Iran has rejected. Now, how do you assess the fate of the Iran nuclear deal from how you believe the Iranian government sees it at this time with an incoming Biden administration?
So the short answer is that there is a desire on the Iranian side to restore the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, mainly because it would achieve one of the main goals in Tehran, which is getting rid of the current sanctions that have put a lot of pressure on Iran, especially on the economic developments in the country. But when we go a bit deeper into the situation in Tehran, we see the different approaches and the different agendas. As you know, we have in Iran a very complex power structure. We have a government, but we also have institutions that are outside the control of the president. So we have to look at two different and parallel questions. One is, what does the government want? The government is controlled by Rouhani, Zarif, the moderates. They would like to achieve what we can call a compliance for compliance return of the US to the nuclear deal. But when we look at what the other forces, especially the more hardline forces, want, they obviously have a very deep distrust in the Americans, but they also have an agenda that connects to the domestic timeline of developments in Iran, which is basically the upcoming presidential elections in June 2021. So they would like, I would say the hardliners would also like to achieve sanctions relief and get as much as many concessions from the US side as possible, including compensation and maybe other benefits. But they would like to do it themselves. So in other words, they would like to win the presidency in June 2021 and then engage the US side. And this inner conflict within the Iranian political system is creating hiccups. So you have on the one side, the government saying, we would like to see a compliance for compliance. And on the other side, you have, for example, the hardline parliament discussing a law to compel the Iranian government to not only leave the JCPOA, but also leave the NPT. So you have contradicting voices from Iran. But I would say the desire to restore the JCPOA is strong, especially because it will have positive economic effects on the country. But the political path and also the timeline will be difficult. There are also other aspects that we need to understand. There is obviously the pride element. So the Iranian side, no matter whom you would talk to, would say, well, it were the Americans who violated the deal by leaving the deal in 2018. So if they want to re-engage, or in the words of Foreign Minister Zarif, regain a seat at the JCPOA table, then it's the Biden administration who should take the first step. So there is also some space for how to sequence different steps and different actions. So it's generally, a situation where both sides, in my view, would like to achieve something positive, but it will require some creative diplomacy and political decisions on both sides.
When you mention how the conservative camp may want the credit for reestablishing the JCPOA if they can get it, and if they take power, does that mean that between now and the elections that we can't expect much in terms of a return to the JCPOA? Because it doesn't seem to me like an incoming Biden administration is going to offer compensation or an apology.
It's true. It's going to be challenging. I will say a few words about the Iranian side, but then I will come back to the issue of compensation as well, because I think there is space for some creativity. The Iranian side, well, we have to consider the moderates are still in government. They don't control much of the other power centers, parliament, judiciary, supreme leadership, all of the various councils that have an impact on decision-making processes are controlled by the more conservative forces, but the government is still controlled and dominated by the moderates. And we should remember that these types of decisions, for example, the decision whether to re-engage the US within the nuclear deal or whether to make some other strategic decisions, these are made by the so-called Supreme National Security Council. And the Supreme National Security Council is actually chaired by the president, and a number of the moderate ministers are members in it. And it has a secretary called Ali Shamkhani, who is a former RGC commander, but really closer to the, let's say, centrists in the Iranian politics. So the question is, can the current composition of the Supreme National Security Council convince all the others that this is the right step to take? And that will heavily depend on the type of discourse and the type of, let's say, offers or incentives that the Biden administration would sort of extend to the Iranian side. And that's why the notion of compensation is important. For example, Mr. Ghalibaf, who the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who is one of the hardliners, sort of arch conservatives, in his speech yesterday, there was a very interesting nuance. He obviously repeated all the revolutionary anti-American narrative, but then he said the Americans have to make up for the losses that Iran has suffered. He didn't say they have to pay a compensation. So making up for these losses could also be, for example, and in my view, it should be something that is feasible on the American side, if the Biden administration indicates that it will not object to a $5 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund to Iran. Iran has applied for this fund, for this loan in the light of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the Iranian economy. So far, the Trump administration had sort of undermined the process or had rejected the process of decision-making, but IMF has also not said no. So if the Biden administration says, we are going to remove the American objection to this loan, and this loan is actually approved, it would look like a very nice sort of starting point without any payment or without any real compensation from the US side, but it could be sold on the Iranian side as a positive gesture to then justify the next step. So I think that's why I said there is a need for creative diplomacy and political decision-making, and that is what it will take. If even President-elect Biden, before he takes office, gives an interview and mentions that once he's president, he will remove some of these obstacles, or he will immediately issue some executive orders lifting some of the harsher sanctions of the past couple of years, it could be seen as a positive gesture. Even it could be seen within the Iranian context, it could be seen as an apology. So again, you can package steps by the Biden administration in a way that it will lead to a positive process of decision-making on the Iranian side.
Bijan, you mentioned President Rouhani, Mr. Shamkhani, other figures. What about the supreme leader? It doesn't seem like he would be enthusiastic about a return to diplomacy.
He is not enthusiastic because he has been generally over the past 30 years, where he has sort of controlled Iranian politics as the supreme leader, he has had a very deep distrust in the Americans. But this deep distrust didn't impede the process of nuclear negotiations under the Obama administration. We should remember that even back then he said he agreed because the political decision makers in Iran were in favor of it, but he still distrusted the Americans. Unfortunately, the actions by the Trump administration confirmed his view that you couldn't trust the American side in these types of negotiations. But again here, if, let's say, President-elect Biden gives an interview and mentions this very fact, that the behavior of the Trump administration eroded a lot of confidence in the US side, not just on the Iranian side, but also on the European side and other international stakeholders, and indicates that he would address some of these issues. For example, you did mention that also the Biden administration, also the US side, would like to address some of the shortcomings of the nuclear deal, whether they are sunsets or other aspects. Well, the Iranian side also has grievances, and one of them is that, well, as long as the sanctions waivers on the US side are just presidential executive orders, then any change of presidency could undermine the process. For example, what if the Biden administration came in and said it would try to codify some of these new decisions or some of the sanctions removals in congressional laws? Something like that could, again, lead to a debate inside Iran where sort of the pro-engagement forces in Iran, whether it's President Rouhani or others, go to Khamenei and say, this is what we have been asking for, and President Biden is delivering that, and that is an opportunity. So Khamenei is distrustful, but he doesn't reject it ideologically. He wants to see a more beneficial scenario for Iran, and if that can be achieved through new negotiations, then he would still probably have the distrust, but he would not impede the process, in my view.
Bijan, one more question on the Iran deal. The IAEA, the most recent IAEA report says that Iran continues to increase its stockpile of enriched uranium. That could be complicating because the Biden administration, or the incoming Biden administration, said that it expects Iran to be in compliance. Why is Iran continuing to increase the amounts of enriched uranium? It's still below the threshold required to create a nuclear weapon, but is Iran hedging here in advance of perceived negotiation, or in case a new deal can't be worked out?
I think it's more really increasing the leverage on the Iranian side. I mean, don't forget, even though the Trump administration is on its way out, they are still sort of passing new sanctions against Iran. And Iran realizes that once it gets to the point of negotiating either a new deal or negotiating a compliance for compliance, there will be US leverage. And that is mainly the sanctions that the Trump administration introduced outside the realm of the nuclear sanctions, which were lifted anyhow. So the Iranian side, I think, is increasing its leverage, preparing for the scenario of negotiations. And I think as far as I can see, the Biden camp, which includes a lot of people who actually negotiated the original nuclear deal, they understand what the Iranians are doing, and they would understand that obviously once it gets to the negotiations, that they would have to ask the Iranian side to reduce the stockpile. And it's interesting to remember that even though they have increased their stockpile, it's still far below the level it was when the nuclear deal was signed in 2015. So it will just take a couple of months to either convert some of this enriched uranium into powder or just move it outside Iran. So it's a quick process. The only element of the nuclear deal, this is also important to consider, the only element of the activities of the past couple of years on the Iranian side that cannot be undone is the research and development. So the Iranians, once they started to also reduce their compliance in response to the US lack of compliance, they also started researching new generations of centrifuges. And that knowledge obviously cannot be undone, but everything else, whether it's number of centrifuges or stockpiles, they can be reduced to the level of full compliance within a couple of months.
Bijan, one more question on the Iran nuclear deal. Would Iran ever consider giving up domestic production of enriched uranium as the UAE has done in its nuclear deal with the United States?
I would be very surprised if the Iranian side would do that. I mean, their argument is that they need enrichment for some of their civilian nuclear activities, whether it's civilian power plants, nuclear power plants, or the medicinal nuclear technology that they have. And the other element in it is this notion of independence. Don't forget, we are talking about a country that has been sanctioned for more than 40 years now. The inherent psychology of Iran is that it should never depend on the outside forces, no matter who they are, because they can sanction and limit Iran's access to specific items and services. So I would be very surprised if Iran ever accepted that.
You mentioned the name of the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf. He's considered one of the contenders for president. The elections are in June of 2021. You mentioned that he's a conservative. He also has COVID-19 at this time. Tell us a little more about him, his prospects as a candidate, and who else may be in the running, and what are the issues that most Iranians are concerned about at this point? Obviously, you mentioned the sanctions in the economy. That would obviously be at the top of the agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a couple of words about Ghalibaf. Ghalibaf has run for president before, and the first time in 2005 when Ahmadinejad won the elections, and also in 2013 when President Rouhani won the election. He definitely has support in the population. He's obviously a leading, I call the group that Ghalibaf belongs to RGC, commanders turned politicians. And so he has segments of the Revolutionary Guards networks and segments of the conservative elite. So he definitely has a network that is encouraging him to run. He also successfully became the top candidate, the top representative of Tehran in the current parliament, and also the Speaker of the Parliament. But he has a number of limitations. Most importantly, during the time when he was mayor of Tehran, there was a lot of corruption in the municipality of Tehran. And these corruption files are coming out one after the other. And he and his team have been exposed with corruption and mismanagement in the municipality of Tehran. And I can imagine that if he becomes the top conservative candidate, it would be very easy for his opponents to expose him to the tenure as mayor of Tehran. And this is exactly also the point that the people care about: corruption, mismanagement. Essentially, maybe as a result of the political competition, it's becoming more and more clear that sanctions are only one part of the story of the economic misery in Iran. Corruption and mismanagement and incompetence are the other aspects. And if we say the top priority for the people, but also for the regime, is to improve the economic conditions, then the question will be who can manage the economy and also manage the governance structures in a way that there is less corruption and there is a more expertise-based or merit-based management of the economy. So within that light, if the regime as a whole manages to mobilize the society to to participate in the elections, because this is the one scenario we have to consider. If there is no improvement economically, and if the country is still struggling with COVID-19 and all of these sort of stagflation situation that we have, then the most likely scenario is that there will be a very low turnout in the elections, and a low turnout usually benefits the conservative candidates, and in that scenario, someone like Ghalibaf could potentially win the election. But there are other aspects. On the one side, we have the challenge for the regime as a whole to mobilize the people. It's very interesting. Every time they want to mobilize people, someone, and this time it was the spokesperson of the so-called Guardian Council, talks about the possibility of women running as candidates. And again, last week, the spokesperson of the Guardian Council said it is conceivable that women can run as presidential candidate. And if that happens, obviously, and depending on the candidate, there could be some mobilization. The other element that will play a role is that Mr. Khamenei has mentioned a couple of times that he would like to see a younger figure, a younger politician as the next president. So he sort of the notion of passing on the revolution to the next generation. So if that becomes the main theme, Ghalibaf is an old figure, and then we would have to look for younger figures. And there are some younger persons, figures, political actors who have ambitions. One of them is, again, a Revolutionary Guards commander, the head of the so-called Khatam al-Anbiya group of companies, which is the largest RGC company. His name is Mohammad Said, and there are lots of indications that he has the ambition to become the next president. So we may have surprise candidates. If we talk about younger individuals, there will also be a younger candidate on the moderate side. That is the current Vice President for Technological Affairs, Mr. Sattori. So we will have to wait and see who will not be nominated, and also who will be vetted by the Guardian Council, because that's the other important aspect.
Iran has, as you mentioned, really suffered because of COVID-19, the sanctions since the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018, and low oil prices. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, the IMF is expecting about 3% growth next year. You've written for Al Monitor about how Iranian reforms and adaptations may have some positive long-term impact if, as you said before, they can get corruption under control. Tell us, how do you see the prospects for Iran's economy, and how compelling is the need, I would say very much so at this point, to deal with lifting sanctions, or do you see the Iranian economy able to muddle through?
Generally, if you also look at previous periods of harsh sanctions against Iran, especially the ones between 2010 and 2013, you always recognize a pattern that the Iranian economy sort of needs a couple of years to adapt to new realities. These new realities are partly, for example, what has happened this time as well, the devaluation of the currency, the changing trading patterns, the fact that you have to circumvent sanctions through third countries or find alternative solutions for the sort of financial transactions. That's why also last time in the period that I just mentioned, we had a 2-year period of stagnation and then a period of growth. That also explains the prediction of the World Bank that in 2021 the Iranian economy would grow by 3.2%. What hasn't been factored in as yet, in my view, is the very devastating impact of the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, we should not forget, and it's not fully sort of, Iran has not fully managed the crisis. It's still feeling the negative impact of the COVID-19 crisis. So we have to wait and see what happens. The lifting of sanctions will make things not only easier, but also, let's say, less expensive for the Iranian economy. Don't forget, sanctions can be circumvented, and they are being circumvented, but the circumvention means that everything becomes more expensive and everything becomes more cumbersome. So the lifting of sanctions will ease the process of economic recovery. And then the most important aspect of the lifting of sanctions for the Iranian economy is the fact that there would be a greater potential for foreign investment in the country, because that is what the Iranian economy needs. The Iranian economy has a lot of capacities, and that's why it has been so resilient against external sanctions. But it does need investments, especially at a time when the government is not in a financial position to engage in infrastructure investment and other investments. So that is why, for example, within the current context and within the current debates in Iran, the so-called Iran-China partnership is so important for Iran, because within that partnership agreement, China commits to investing in Iran, investing extensively in Iran. So the lifting of sanctions, again, will pave the way for the needed investments to come in from international players. So the economy will probably return to marginal growth, but it's still well below the type of growth that the Iranian economy needs to create the types of jobs and the types of sort of development potential that the society needs. In the absence of an 8% annual growth, Iran's unemployment situation will become will sort of worsen on an annual basis, and that will obviously lead to a lot of other socioeconomic and political hiccups. So again, back to your question, the economy can survive, but it cannot grow without the lifting of sanctions.
You mentioned China. Both Russia and China are signatories to the Iran nuclear deal, and any effort by the United States to deal with Iran or broker a new deal or work through multilateral diplomacy will involve Moscow and Beijing. And tell us a little more about how Iran sees its ties with both countries. You mentioned they want Chinese investment. What does Iran expect and what's possible? And I might add that the UN embargo on selling or buying weapons from Iran expired last month. And do you see Russia and China as selling arms to Iran?
Mm-hmm. To understand what's happening in Iran's international relations right now, we need to just remind ourselves why Iran engaged the international powers to sign the nuclear deal. Back in 2012, when the secret meeting started and then later the nuclear negotiations in 2013, the Iranian strategy was to normalize trade and investment relations with the European Union. That's really what they were after. And if you look closely at the nuclear deal, this is what they achieved. They never attempted to get rid of the primary sanctions by the Americans. They wanted the secondary American sanctions to be lifted so that the European companies could work with Iran. And what they wanted was technology and investment. Because, as I said, these are the two elements that the Iranian economy needs to grow. Well, the experience of the JCPOA taught the Iranians that you can't really have the European Union without the US. And as long as the US is out there sanctioning Iran with primary and secondary sanctions, they have to forget the Western powers and focus on the Eastern powers. And this is exactly what's happening, a focus on the Eastern powers for two reasons. One is they can act independently. They are not going to always watch what the Americans are saying. And second, their trade and investment relations with Russia and China are not attached to political and human rights issues and debates on other levels. And these are exactly the two types of expectations that Iran would have. So they are looking for closer ties with both Russia and China. They see Russia and China not only as providers of capital and technology, but also as markets. We should not forget that. And also as the suppliers of those technologies that the Western powers will not supply Iran with. And that is obviously mainly arms related technologies, military equipment, even sometimes policing and security equipment. So yes, to answer your question, I believe that Russia and China will sell arms to Iran, and obviously in the current global economic situation, that would, pave the way for new markets for them. But thinking about the arms embargo, the lifting of the arms embargo, we should also remember that Iran is a producer of arms, and Iran is working towards becoming an exporter of arms internationally. And again, here you can say, well, what are they going to do in light of American sanctions? Well, exactly the same thing they have done in light of American sanctions with exporting oil and exporting other items. They will find markets and they will find solutions. So the tendency towards Eastern powers is there, is strong, is politically accepted by all, but it doesn't mean that they don't want good relations with Europe as well. Because as one very astute analyst on the Iranian side said it once, China and Russia take Iran more seriously if Iran has a good relationship with Europe as well. So that they feel Iran has alternatives. So that's why a return to the nuclear negotiations and to the nuclear deal could again entail for Iran that they improve their relationship with Western powers, but they do rely more on the Eastern powers right now.
Bijan, as time is getting short here with us, I do want to spend a little bit of our remaining time on Iran's policy in the region. Now, Iran is now facing a new alignment given Israel's normalization with the UAE and Bahrain. And interestingly, this follows some steps of goodwill between Tehran and Abu Dhabi earlier this year around COVID, when the UAE reached out on humanitarian grounds. How does Iran see the regional picture in the Gulf post-normalization?
Obviously, it's a new situation, and I guess it will require a number of debates within the different decision-making sort of structures in Iran. But my assumption is, first, Iran is not worried about this situation. Don't forget, Iran has had good working relationships with other regional powers who have had close relations with Israel before, whether it was Turkey at a specific time or the Republic of Azerbaijan in the past 2 decades or so. Iran is not worried as long as the relationship does not translate into Israeli security forces or Israeli military taking advantage of that relationship, for example, with the UAE or with Bahrain, to work against Iranian interests. That obviously becomes a challenge, and I'm sure as soon as there are signs that something like that is happening, Iran will react differently. But again, I doubt that we would see that, at least for the time being, because all of these smaller Persian Gulf countries, they also obviously know that Iran is there, is right next door, and Iran could undermine their their interests as well. There is another aspect in the process. Obviously, the rhetorical reaction from Iran was harsh, and it's sort of condemned the UAE and Bahrain and others as traitors. But don't forget that within the Islamic world, the more Islamic countries sign deals with Israel, the more Iran becomes the main protector of the Palestinian cause, or the main antagonist to Israel, which creates some degree of soft power, if you want. May not be very important in the overall picture, but it's there. So I would say, rhetorically, we can obviously expect condemnation from Iran. Practically, I don't think it will change the situation. And the Iranians understand that the UAE may, on the one side, sign a deal with Israel to achieve points with the Trump administration, but on the other side, will also have a dialogue with Iran on a number of issues. So as far as Iran is concerned, in my view, on the real security and regional challenges on the ground, at the time being, I don't think it has changed the regional picture for Iran.
The U.S. has made clear that it will not tolerate escalation by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. And in January of this year, it killed Revolutionary Guard Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in response from militia attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, which killed an American. But Tehran also sees its relationship with Iraq as vital, especially under sanctions, but for many reasons. On the one hand, Tehran backs Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, yet seems to struggle with stepping back from the influence that these militias have. How does Iran see Iraq and the stakes there, including regarding Iraq's relationship with the United States?
I would say Iran-Iraq relations are the top priority for the Iranian government and for the Iranian state as a whole, for various reasons. I mean, the most important element in it is the security aspect of a close relationship. Iraq has the longest land border with Iran. We have had a history of war and confrontation. And don't forget, Iraq is the second largest Shiite majority population in the world. So there are so many aspects, cultural, religious, and on top of it, Iraq is the most important market for non-oil exports from Iran. So whichever sort of power center you look at, whether it's an economic power center, cultural, or political, Iran-Iraq relations and getting them right is the top priority. And as such, the Iranians have tried to develop a strategy. You mentioned the aspect of attacking, let's say, U.S. interests in Iraq. It's true that there was a sense of escalation in late 2019, and it was part of the package of escalating and creating a cost to the Trump administration. But you can also see that there has been a de-escalation in the past few months, potentially just waiting for the outcome of the US elections. And I think how the US-Iraq relations factor in, we will have to analyze once the Biden administration is in. But Iran, in my view, has had a very careful strategy, and it's probably one of the areas where all the different power centers in Iran are very coordinated. You don't see this level of coordination in other policy areas, but with regards to Iraq relations, there is a lot of debate and coordination, and as I said, with the desire to maintain a cordial neighborly relationship and with a high level of economic integration. Don't forget, Iraq depends on energy imports from Iran, both electricity and gas, and both countries have a very deep desire to deepen the economic ties. I mean, the planned volume for, or the targeted volume for bilateral trade is $20 billion, which would be amazing for the Iranian economy. And right now, Iraq is also playing an important role in helping Iranian companies circumvent some of the sanctions, as I mentioned earlier.
John, is Iran doing any reassessment of its regional policies due to U.S. Increased sanctions and pressure on the Syrian government and Hezbollah in Lebanon? Does it see itself winning or losing in Lebanon and Syria, given the events of the last year?
I don't think they have come to a conclusion. I think the situation is still very fluid. But again, don't forget, when we talk about Iran and the assessment of its regional policies, we have to ask ourselves, are we talking about the Iranian government? Or are we talking about the sort of revolutionary guards as one of the key stakeholders in the regional activities, regional networks, and so on? The revolutionary guards, in my view, the only aspect of whether we want to call it reassessment or change is that, in my view, the revolutionary guards are looking at Syria and even Iraq within an economic assessment, and now more and more, rather than within a sort of regional security assessment. The economic assessment says, well, we have invested so much money in these countries. We have fought ISIS. We have helped them, provide security in their country. Now is the time for us to reap the benefits from those investments and secure projects and secure economic interests in these countries. That is a very different attitude compared to a few years ago, where the notion was we have to be present in those countries so that ISIS would never get into Iranian territory. That reassessment is there. There is certainly a debate inside the country on whether these policies have been successful or whether Iran would have been better off spending some of that money or some of that effort within the country. But obviously, as I said, the situation is still very fluid, and I don't think we can have a final conclusion about how the Iranian regime feels about the regional policies.
Bijan, we're just about out of time. I want to ask you a big question, short answer to a big question, if I can. Is the Iranian government stronger or weaker as a result of maximum pressure the last few years and COVID and corruption, as you've been talking about? Many in the United States have implicitly or explicitly talked about regime change. Is that a realistic policy in dealing with Iran?
No, it's not a realistic policy. I mean, the sanctions have hurt Iran without a doubt, economically, politically, socially, whatever aspect you look at, in terms of the confidence of the Iranian population also in the Iranian state and state institutions. There have been lots of costs to the Iranian regime, but this is not a regime that is built on sort of popular sentiments. It's a regime that has evolved from a revolutionary state into trying to become a more stable regional player. And in looking at the different stakeholders of that regime, especially because it's probably the most important element, looking at the revolutionary guards, in my view, they have been empowered as a result of the Trump policies over the past few years. I mean, if you sanction a country like Iran is not a country that will just sit back and say, well, we lost, the Americans are sanctioning us. They will actually resist and develop, as I said, new approaches. And those new approaches, whether it's greater domestic capacity building, whether it's weakening the government, and so on, they all have benefited the Revolutionary Guards, and to an extent where political stakeholders find it justified to say the next president should be a commander of the Revolutionary Guards, because we are the only ones who can manage this country and this economy. So in my view, it has actually backfired, and I don't see a regime change in the cards.
Bijan, last question. It seems that the list of Americans held in Iran is down to 3: Siamak Namazi, his father Bakr Namazi, and Mordad Tabaz, dual nationals. There are other dual nationals from other countries held as well. Do you see prospects for an exchange and getting their release from these unjust detention in the coming months?
I sincerely hope so. I mean, it's really sad, especially Siamak Namazi, who has been now the longest held dual citizen in Iran for more than 5 years. All of these individuals, the Iranian Americans, but also the Iranian European dual citizens, they have all become victims of a political game, of a sort of culture of hostage taking on the Iranian side. If we look at the past patterns, especially the major prisoner swap that happened on the same day as the JCPOA was implemented on the 16th of January 2016, if the two sides engage and they find a formula for compliance, then there would be room for some de-escalation, which would also include prisoner swaps or releases of prisoners. In my view, it's on the one side a sad fact on the Iranian side that the Iranian stakeholders and decision makers continue to take hostages, but also a sad fact that the American, or let's say the Trump administration, did not realize that escalating relations with Iran is not going to help the freedom of these hostages. I hope that the Biden administration will find ways of de-escalation, which hopefully then also would lead to the release of these prisoners.
Bijan, thank you for joining us today on the Middle East. This was a fascinating discussion, a really comprehensive analysis and conversation about what's happening in Iran and what we might expect in U.S.-Iran relations. Much appreciated for your joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great to be here. Thank you.
We will be right back with a few closing remarks and takeaways from my conversation just now with Bijan Khajehpour after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts, and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel, Al Monitor.
Welcome back. A few takeaways from our conversation just now with Bijan Khajehpour. First, Bijan sees the transition to a Biden administration as the opportunity for some creative diplomacy with Iran. He said not to be put off by Iran's calls for compensation and an apology. The more nuanced and practical approach, from Bijan's perspective, would be for the Biden administration to instead signal that the U.S. will not block a pending IMF loan to Iran, as the Trump administration has done, and that it will rescind many of the executive orders that imposed oil and banking sanctions on Iran. Now, second, Bijan mentioned that Iran's increasing of its stockpile of enriched uranium is leverage for coming negotiations with the United States, not a sign that it's pursuing a nuclear weapon, and that this stockpile, which has still not reached pre-2015 levels, can actually be reduced in a short amount of time. That said, Iran is unlikely to consider a position of zero enrichment, as we have discussed in previous podcasts with both Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Ron Dermer and UAE ambassador to the U.S. Yusuf El-Taiba. Zero enrichment would indeed be the preferred approach for an Iran nuclear deal by both Israel and the UAE. The U.S. under Biden will also be engaging its regional allies about Iran, I think even more so than was the case during the JCPOA negotiations. Third, problematic for an incoming Biden administration is that Bijan says Iran is likely to buy arms from Russia and China and to sell arms as well. It's tough, I think, for the U.S. to swallow the lifting of sanctions on Iran arms imports and exports. As I have mentioned previously and written at El Monitor, the path to a new Iran deal will end up going through Moscow and Beijing. Fourth, whether the U.S. can capture a new Iran deal in a treaty, as Bijan says would be the preference in Iran rather than executive orders, would likely depend first on the progress in diplomacy with Iran, and secondly, or indeed concurrently, Biden's relationship with the next Congress, where the Senate may be in Republican hands, pending the outcome of the Senate runoff elections in Georgia on January 5th. Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East, and thanks to our production team of Phil Calabro of El Monitor and Beowulf Rochland of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next week, and in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other El Monitor podcast on Israel at your favorite podcast platform.